Welcome to the special natural disaster episode of Hometown Weather. We're going to take a look at hurricanes and tornadoes, things like that, what exactly they are, what they do, and what you should know about them. All right, so two big natural disasters, tornadoes and hurricanes. Very, very different, although they do cause similar damage, you could say. So tornadoes are land-based. Hurricanes are strictly ocean-based. So the two kind of die out when they go in the opposite way. Tornadoes rarely make it to the ocean, and hurricanes just fade when they go over land. So tornadoes are very powerful, very strong winds, up to 200 miles per hour, even faster than that sometimes. They are rapid. Hurricanes have strong winds. They can get up to 100, but nothing like the winds you see in a tornado. Now, a big difference here is the size. Tornadoes are very small. If you see a tornado marking on a map, it's like a little pencil line. That's what it would look like on a map, just because they're really thin. They kind of clear out this path of disaster. So they can be probably up to about a mile in width. They're rarely that big. They're usually even smaller than half a mile. Hurricanes, on the other hand, very large. They could be 500, even 600 miles wide. So they could, if on one end they're touching Cape Cod, the other end they're in Buffalo, New York, that big. And they kind of come sweep right up the coast. So they're big, 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 large storms, and they kind of move slower. Now, for a tornado to develop, they form and dissolve within minutes. This is what makes them so hard to forecast, because it starts out as a strong thunderstorm, and then a tornado will form out of that, but a tornado could form and dissolve in 1 minute like that. Just like that. So it's not like we could say there's going to be a tornado in 2 days. We can't really say that because they just come out of nowhere, really. Now, what we can do is say there's a possibility for a tornado based on the conditions. They're favorable or not favorable. But they're difficult to forecast just because they're so rapid. A hurricane's a lot different. Hurricanes are like a marathon. It's this long, slow process. They start up, and it's just day by day, you're slowly following it step by step. So preemptive notice is a lot easier in hurricanes. You get a lot more notice to evacuate. Tornadoes, you don't really get to evacuate, you kind of just hunker down. So a tornado to reach its full size, or a hurricane to reach its full size, by the time it goes from tropical storm to hurricane, that could be a 2-week process right there. Just because to build a storm that's 500 miles wide, you need so much evaporation, so much energy in that storm to get something that big going. So what's the driving force on these things here? So for tornado, it is heat rapidly rising. That's why they are more prone to the southern areas like, say, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Oklahoma, areas like that where you get a really, really hot day, a lot of ground heat just rises up so quick. When that heat rises, it can cause sinking air to come down in a funneling manner, which can just cause just a column of air to rotate rapidly as it comes down, and then that can spin a tornado. So as a hurricane goes, they pretty much form by large-scale evaporation. Evaporation from warm ocean water. Now, warm ocean water, what does that really mean? Well, in the Caribbean, that's like if the water gets up to 84, 85 degrees. That's warm ocean water. Even though that's just a few degrees warmer than 80, that much warmer makes such a big difference when it comes to evaporation, because it's just that bit of heat gets you that much more water, and things like that can happen on just such a small scale. 1 degree warmer ocean water just heightens your risk for a hurricane. That's why they typically happen in the fall when water is warmest. So how do hurricanes get so big? They begin just west of Africa. So they begin there, they follow the trade winds, kind of just slowly around the equator, and then they start to bend as they get toward that warm water. They're traveling thousands and thousands of miles before they even get in our range. So thousands and thousands of miles over nothing but ocean, all that time just evaporating, picking up water, getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and just more active, and there's just more going on, more unstable. So in doing that, they grow in size. That's what gets them to be so colossal. It's all that time spent over water gets them to be that big. When water gets really warm, that's where they get big. That's where they get a lot of evaporation. That's what drives them. So when you hit colder water, they don't form as easily, so that's why there are not as many in the earlier summer. all that energy from the evaporated water, what that does is it polarizes the storm. The low pressure gets lower, and then it just causes air to be even more unstable, which gives you more sinking motion, and that creates the shape of a hurricane. Hurricanes continue to drop their rain no matter where they go. They're going to rain and rain and rain. Now, in order for them to maintain that size, they need just as much evaporation as they need rainfall. So when they make landfall, they can't really evaporate as much water. There's not as much water there, so they just dwindle. They just drop all their water and they can't rebuild. Also, as they move over the cooler water in the northern Atlantic, you need so much more energy to evaporate cooler water. They just don't do it as efficiently, so they don't gain as much water. Therefore, they die down to a storm and then fade out into nothing. So the cooler water and land are the things that cause hurricanes to fade. So that sort of sweet spot for them is right in that southeast. Before you get up into the inland states in the south, and before you get up past like the Delmarva and the Carolinas toward the North Atlantic. That is where hurricanes kind of live. That's their hot spot. Aside from that, they go outside that zone, they're going to fade out and die. All right, what more do you have to be worried about hurricanes? How about that eye? What is that all about? Like, what does that mean? So all that warm evaporating air is going to rise, rise, rise. Now, what goes up must come down. So if air goes up, it can't just go up and that's that. The place it's taking, that air moves up. The air that was in that space that was originally up comes down to take the space where the evaporation used to be. So you kind of have this action going like this here. You can see in this graphic right here, the warmth rises and then it causes to sink right in the middle. That's because right here where this rain is, that's going to give you this big warm updraft. And that's why these winds are around the kind of funnel path of a hurricane. The eye right here is that sinking cold air. It's really kind of dry, it's still, wind is like nothing, and pressure's very low. So here's an image from hurricane hunters of the eye of a hurricane. You can almost see, if you look real close, you can almost sense this, you can see the clouds kind of just dropping into this funnel. And that's literally what it looks like. You just see air just dropping to the ground. So the air at the ground was from way, way up in the sky, where not where airplanes fly, but about halfway up to that distance. So it gets really cool when you get to the center of a storm like that. Even when we get big thunderstorms up here, when you get to the center of it, you get this sort of cooling. It's a downdraft from the upper atmosphere. That's what causes that, and that's what causes an eye wall. It's a funneling shape in the middle of cold air sinking down that got pushed out of there because all this warm air got forced up. That's what an eye is about. What next? About hurricanes. Those winds, boy oh boy, we see some big numbers. How damaging are they? So a tornado, the winds wipe out everything in their path. A tornado has its way with anything. If it comes through, if it touches an object, it does what it wants with it. It can pick it up, throw it, house, a car, even like landforms. It can damage hills and things. They just destroy everything in their path. Now, hurricanes are not quite as damaging as that. Just the winds are not as strong, but they can still do a lot of damage. If you are outside in a hurricane, they can still push you and move you, and it's really difficult to walk in them. Tornado, on the other hand, if the wind catches you, you're gone. It's going to pick you up, throw you wherever it goes. It'll even put you in the funnel sometimes. So the big issue with winds in a hurricane is debris. So what they do is they knock around a lot of smaller debris. Like a hurricane will not lift up a house, but it could knock some shingles off the roof. It does a lot of damage to trees. It can knock palm fronts down. It can knock branches off trees. And that debris hitting people, that can cause damage. That's why you don't want to be outside in those winds of a hurricane. It's because if debris were to strike you, it could be damaging, even though the winds alone aren't going to kill you. So smaller debris is the real danger in hurricanes because they become projectiles. All right, what is the real cause of destruction in the hurricanes? Two big things, flooding and also big ocean waves, really big. So a hurricane can drop 12 inches of rain on a place when it rains. 12 inches of rain, just for some perspective, is the equivalent of 10 feet of snow 10 feet. That's hard to even imagine. Think of our snowiest winter. Did you see 10 feet of snow stacked? Not really. Now imagine all that being in rain. Where is that rain going to go? That's a lot of rain. It is copious. Flat areas do not drain well. Take Florida, for example. Florida does not have hills. When rain falls on it, it just kind of hits the ground. It doesn't roll down a hill or roll into a sewer like we have up here. It just kind of falls and rolls to its lowest point. So that's why they dig out canals and little kind of divots on the side of the road around there. It's to desperately get that hurricane water out when it rains. So a place like New Orleans, similar situation. Water gets there, it just kind of sits there. It does not drain very easily. You can see in this image right here, it's floodwater from a hurricane. It's just still. It's not like you have this rushing water. It's just still there. So it has to either be evaporated or pumped out. So that's why it can take a lot to kind of repair damage to this, because you just got to get all that water out of there. Now, on the other hand, if you have steep hills, the water will run down, but that's going to lead to mudslides. If you have rapidly running water and you kind of create this sort of river, the stream situation on a hill, if it's not fit for a stream, it's going to pick up all the dirt with it, and that water will turn into mud very quickly. And that's why in a lot of the Caribbean countries that are kind of centered around a hill in the middle, you get mudslides, and those are dangerous. And again, that's because of steep hills. If you have gradual hills, it's not as bad, but steep hills cause that to happen. Now let's look at the other thing, big ocean waves. Strong storms, what they do is they sort of agitate the ocean. So if you take a soda and shake it up, and it gets real foamy, that's what the ocean looks like when there's something like a hurricane coming by. It's just real, like, kind of foamy, agitated, shooken up. But what happens is, as the winds pass and you get toward that eye wall, the waves kind of get bigger, and then eventually really big, and then eventually even bigger than that. So it's like walls of water just keep coming at the shore. So sand dunes are only made to block 10 to 15 feet of water in height. Now, the impact of a wave that's up to 30 feet in size can wipe out a dune alone. It can take all that sand and push it wherever it wants, because the collision of that water on the shore will move any amount of sand, let alone what it would do to a boardwalk, a pier, or even a house that's close to water. So once those waves comes in, knock out the dunes, there is nothing to protect the land from the ocean. Dunes are gone. Every wave is going to just go right onto shore. So you get ocean water rushing onto land, and if that gets into drinking water supplies, ocean water is not pure, it's not healthy, you run into a lot of issues beyond just flooding. So the waves and the flooding are what really causes the damage in hurricanes. So let's look at, beyond just some hurricanes, let's look at two big ones that come to mind. The one we just had, Hurricane Harvey. So we know this one hit Houston. It impacted the Texas coast in addition to the Caribbean, but Houston would be probably the place that was least equipped for it that got hit. And then there was Katrina. So Katrina hit the Gulf Coast and New Orleans, very strong winds, 175 miles per hour. Now, Harvey was a Category 4, Katrina was a Category 5. 40 inches of rain fell from Harvey. No one in Texas has ever seen that before. That's a lot of rain. That's about half the rain they get in a whole year normally in Houston, 40 inches. So Houston does have some hills. Texas does have some drainage, but 40 inches of rain doesn't drain well from anywhere. That's just so much that it's copious. You know, you have to do something with it right away. It's all there. So it causes a very difficult living situation. Now, Katrina, up to 1,500 people died from Hurricane Katrina. There's about 70 confirmed dead as of right now for Hurricane Harvey. That number could change a little bit, but it's nowhere near 1,500. The numbers are on just different scales even. So the damage for Katrina was estimated to be around $108 billion. Damage for Harvey was around $100 billion. So interesting, for 70 dead versus 1,500 dead, the damage is that similar. That's an interesting figure there. Now, 30% of Harris County submerged underwater. Harris County incorporates Houston and Houston's metro area. 30% of that is underwater. Right there, you're talking about 30%, you're talking about 2.5 million people in where they live. 30% of Harris County. Houston's a big city, so a lot of people living there, their living situation's affected. That makes it a big event. So New Orleans. This will give you a little perspective on just what Katrina did to that city. So in 2014 American Community Survey, the population of New Orleans was 538,000. It was a little bit smaller than Boston. In the 2006 American Community Survey, it was just below 300,000, making it about the size of Buffalo, New York. So a lot of New Orleans just flat abandoned their homes in that city after Katrina, just because the damage was so much, jobs were gone, it just caused so much trouble for the citizens of New Orleans that they just didn't even bother coming back. Many of them didn't even bother to see what their house looked like after Katrina. They just left. So Katrina, just in terms of life-wise, was a very, very tragic event. Harvey was more so financial damage that it did to the economy of Houston. So why was Hurricane Katrina worse? Let's look at the facts here. New Orleans is below sea level, is very susceptible to flooding. If you're near the coast and below sea level, you got an issue. You need some sort of protection. So they do have protection. New Orleans did have hurricane barriers on their beaches south of there. So New Orleans is just not really a well-drained area because that's the nature of Louisiana in the delta of the Mississippi River. It just doesn't drain well. So what they have there is a levee that it's sort of like a giant barge that holds up the water. And when Katrina came, that broke. It was just too much on it. So every bit of water that's being held out of New Orleans was let go. And that literally soaked through the lower and upper Ninth Ward of New Orleans on through most of the city. So that flooding was really what caused it. The fact that New Orleans was not well set up for this storm, and then the levee broke. That's really what the damage was from, not necessarily wind or rain, but although that did affect it. So New Orleans is situated on a bayou. A bayou is like a swamp. Now, swamps don't have strong winds, nor do they have much of a current in their water. They kind of have just still water. And it's not easy to travel around New Orleans. It's kind of this city in this sort of swampy area. So there's not as many roads. The Pontchartrain Bridge that takes you out to the mainlands, it's not a big bridge. Houston, on the other hand, is a very well-trafficked city. There's lots of things going in and out of Houston, many roads. The roads are bigger, wider open, so it's much easier to evacuate Houston than it is to evacuate New Orleans. New Orleans, it's kind of is what it is in its location. Another thing, poverty is far worse in New Orleans. So the reason this effect is such a big deal, because in terms of poverty, when a house is ruined, chances are what happened is your job got ruined as well. So if the place you work is gone, you can't return there. If you're in poverty, you're relying on work or whatever financial support you have. Now, in Houston, for example, if you have a house on the beach in Houston, it may be your second home. You may be a wealthier person, and you kind of lose your second home. You say, oh well. You're willing to cut your losses with that because it's the risk of living in such a place. So New Orleans, if your whole life is based there, something like that happens, you have no choice but to leave. And losing jobs in New Orleans was very, very costly for the citizens there. Also, the economy is weaker. In Houston, a lot of the economy is just commerce. There's oil industries. So there's a lot of business there. So that's what caused the big money and damage. The fact that a lot of oil fields were ruined there and just a lot of big companies that are situated there were damaged. That's what caused a lot of the dollar total in money. But a weaker economy in New Orleans, it relies largely on tourism. And after Katrina, you're not going to get a lot of tourists. Your airport's damaged. There's not as much to see. It became a pretty sad area for a couple years. It has recovered a lot since, but a weaker economy means that you're susceptible. If something like that happens, you're susceptible to destruction, and that's what happened to New Orleans. So, also, Hurricane Katrina. Now, this quadrupled our second most devastating hurricane we've seen in the U.S. So I believe it was Hurricane Andrew came in, it was in 1992, it hit Florida. I believe it was Andrew. That was at the time, was our highest damage in terms of a hurricane. Katrina came through, it quadrupled that. So it's a bit like 9/11 in a sense. We've been shaken up. We now look at this differently. We have much better emergency evacuation, emergency readiness, and we're well better prepared for something like Harvey. So as soon as this happened, support got in there right away. We were ready for it. Evacuations that were necessary were done. So it was mostly only homes damaged rather than people being damaged. So we're just far better prepared. Even though Katrina was more than 10 years ago, still that sensitivity is there, and we just know better now. We learned from Katrina. So Katrina was the scapegoat of everything. Ever since then, hurricanes are never treated the same. That's really why this was the worst. It served as a lesson for us. So, that being said, now, what is next? We got to look at what do we do in terms of hurricanes. So all you really have to worry about are these things. Have an emergency plan. If you live in a hurricane susceptible area, that's anywhere on the Atlantic coast, mind you, because we've seen Sandy before, we know hurricanes can reach up where we are. If you have anything on the beach, or you live in a more tropical area like Louisiana, Texas, Florida, or the Carolinas, you have to have an emergency plan. You need to know what to do in the situation where something like this happens. So if you can do that, you can better prepare yourself to deal with what may happen. Also, take precautions. So if you are somewhere where you have to hunker down, make sure you have what you need to survive on limited resources. Because if a devastating hurricane comes through, grocery stores, food stores, even clean drinking water is not a promise. So you do need to take those precautions when you hear of a hurricane. You see things on the news about people going crazy, buying bottles of water in the store. That's not a bad idea. They're not crazy people. They're doing what they have to do. So precautions like that are necessary if you do want to survive a hurricane. Also, if you evacuate, you want to take similar precautions as well. You may not be able to get home, and if you get home, home may not be the same. So those are kind of precautions you want to take in the event of a hurricane. Another big one is listen to warnings and emergency alerts. Listen to what they say and obey instructions. So typically in Florida, a lot of times tropical storms, hurricanes will pass and they're very small. You can survive them. They're just a lot of rain and they might flood a little bit, nothing too bad. So a lot of people who live in Florida, I used to live in Florida, I would know myself, a lot of people are just so used to staying through hurricanes, they kind of turn a blind eye to it a bit. That's not a good idea because you will get caught off guard when that Category 5 comes. You don't want to be in that situation. Always listen. Even up here, even if we get an emergency alert about snow or cold weather, anything, always just listen to what it has to say and then just do whatever they tell you to do. Because when they're telling you to do something, it's a very important reason why they were told at the highest level you have to issue this warning. So another thing, support one another. So if you are in a situation like this where you can reach out to other people and you can help them, that's what we need to do as humans that live in a community together. We need to be compassionate. We need to kind of fight for each other in times like this. We can't always just protect ourselves, look out for ourselves, do what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. It's very important we support one another. If we do this, we will be much better off as a community and as people as a whole dealing with natural disasters like this. All right, thank you everybody for watching this episode, and make sure you stay safe in terms of any storms.